A road in France, at night, September 1944. No streetlights, no moon worth speaking of, and the truck has no headlights either. Just a pair of blackout slits throwing two thin cat's-eye slivers of light onto the road a few feet ahead. Behind the wheel of that 2.5-ton truck is a young American soldier who has been driving, with barely a break, for something like 20 hours. He is exhausted in a way that has its own physics. His hands know the wheel better than his brain does now. Ahead of him, a red taillight he's been following for miles. Behind him, another set of headlights, or the slits that pass for them. The whole road, as far as he can feel in the dark, is trucks, nose to tail, grinding east. In the back of his truck are cans of gasoline, hundreds of gallons of it. And every one of those gallons is the reason a tank, 100 miles up this road, will be able to move tomorrow morning instead of sitting still. And here is the thing about this young man at the wheel. He is, statistically, almost certainly black. And in the army he is serving, in 1944, that fact is a large part of why he is here, on this road, in the dark, hauling other men's fuel, instead of somewhere else. He is part of an operation with a strange, bright name. They call it the redballexpress. Tonight's file is about him, and about the tens of thousands of men like him, because this is the story of how an army that had terrified the whole German war machine came, in a single week, to a complete and humiliating stop, and how a fleet of trucks, driven mostly by men their own country would not trust with a rifle, got it moving again. Stay with me, because it ends the way too many of these stories end, with the men who did it, forgotten, and then, once, in the strangest way, remembered wrong. To understand the trucks, you have to understand the disaster that made them necessary. And it was, of all things, a disaster of success. In the summer of 1944, after weeks of grinding, bloody stalemate in the hedgerows of Normandy, the American army finally broke loose. And when it broke loose, it ran. George Patton's Third Army poured out into the open country of France and raced east at a speed nobody had planned for, nobody had supplies for, and nobody quite believed. The Germans, who had invented this kind of fast, deep, armored war, who had used it to overrun Europe in 1940, now found themselves on the receiving end of it, and they reeled. It was everything an army dreams of, and it created a problem that no amount of courage could solve. Because an army that moves that fast outruns the thing that feeds it. And what feeds a modern army, more than food, more than ammunition, more than anything, is fuel. Gasoline. Every tank, every truck, every jeep runs on it, and they drink it by the ocean. Patton's Third Army and Hodge's First Army together burned through something like 800,000 gallons of gasoline. Not in a week, in a day, every single day. Now here is the trap, and it is almost too perfect. All of that fuel was sitting back in Normandy, near the beaches where it had been landed, and the army was now 300 miles to the east, and getting further away by the hour. Normally you would move fuel like that forward by railroad. There was just one problem. There were no railroads, not working ones, and here is the part that stings, because the Allies had done it to themselves. In the months before the invasion, Allied bombers had gone after the French rail network and torn it to pieces, on purpose, methodically, bridge by bridge, and marshalling yard by marshalling yard. The whole point had been to stop the Germans from rushing reinforcements to Normandy, and it had worked beautifully. They had crippled the finest rail system in Europe. And now, a few weeks later, that same broken system was the one thing they needed most in the world, and it was not there. They had destroyed their own supply line before they knew they would need it. So picture it, the most feared fighting force in Europe. Tanks that had just torn the German army apart, and they rolled to a stop by the side of the road, one after another, engines ticking as they cool, because the tanks are empty and there is no more gas. Not because the enemy stopped them, because the fuel 300 miles behind them could not get to the front. Patton was beside himself. He is supposed to have said that his men could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas, and he was right, and it changed nothing, because wanting fuel does not move it. While his spearhead sat still, the Germans, who days earlier had been running for their lives, got a priceless gift: time. Time to fall back, dig in, and reset. Every hour those tanks sat empty was an hour the enemy used to make the rest of the war longer and bloodier. There was no railroad. There was only the road, And on the road, there was only one answer: trucks. On the 25th of August, 1944, the American Army launched its answer, and it gave it a name borrowed from the railroads it no longer had. On the old American railroads, a red ball was the marking for priority freight, express cargo, the load that got waved through ahead of everything else. So they called it the Red Ball Express. And the idea was brutally simple, which is exactly why it worked. They took two parallel highways running from the Normandy supply dumps toward the front near Chartres, just short of Paris. They closed both roads to all other traffic, completely. And they turned the pair into a giant one-way loop. One highway carried the loaded trucks east, toward the fighting. The other carried the empty trucks back west, to load up again. No oncoming traffic, no crossroads confusion, no waiting. Military police stood at every junction, and their orders were absolute. If you did not have a red ball, you did not get on that road. Generals were waved aside for it. And every truck, every sign, was marked with the same bright symbol, a single red circle that told everyone who saw it, this load comes first. Then they filled it with trucks. And here we should stop for a second, because the truck itself matters, the way the phone mattered, and the rifle, and the room. Nearly 6,000 vehicles were running that route at its peak, and the great majority of them were one machine, the 2.5-ton truck. The deuce and a half. It is not a glamorous object. It is a plain, snub-nosed, 6-wheel drive cargo truck, and it is one of the genuine war-winning tools of the entire conflict. It would start in the cold, climb out of mud that swallowed everything else, take a beating no vehicle should survive, and keep going. The men who drove it, and the mechanics who nursed it, loved it the way you love something that does not let you down. On the Red Ball, they asked it to carry loads far past what the book allowed, over roads that were never built for it, for days without rest. And it did. And they ran them day and night, around the clock. And the numbers are hard to hold in your head. At its peak, the Red Ball was moving around 12,500 tons of supplies a day. Over the roughly 80 days it ran, it hauled more than 400,000 tons of fuel and ammunition and rations forward, to 28 different divisions. It was, for a while, the largest trucking operation the world had ever seen. Thrown together in a matter of days out of nothing but roads, trucks, and men who did not sleep. Now stand at the edge of one of those roads, at 3 a.m, and watch. There is no moon. There is no conversation. There is only sound. A truck, then another truck. Then another. Nose to tail, no gaps, for as far as the road runs in either direction, hour after hour, engines and dust and the smell of gasoline, a single unbroken river of steel pouring east into the dark. Each driver can see exactly one thing, the tiny red slit of light on the truck ahead of him. That is his whole world. And if that truck stops, he stops, and the truck behind him stops, and the river backs up into the night, all the way to the sea. So nobody stops. That is the only rule that matters. Keep rolling. And it did not always work, because how could it? Men drove until they fell asleep at the wheel and woke up in a ditch, or did not wake up at all. Trucks blew tires and threw rods and simply caught fire, and were shoved off the road so the next one could pass, and mechanics stripped the dead ones for parts to keep the living ones moving. There were crashes in the dark. Terrible ones. There was enemy aircraft overhead. The Red Ball chewed up trucks and tires, and men at a frightening rate. And the answer to all of it was always the same 2 words. Keep rolling. So they kept rolling, and behind every single one of those wheels was a man. Hold on to that, because in a minute we are going to meet him properly. And hold on to one more thing too. All of it. The closed roads, the red circle on every windshield, the 6,000 trucks that never stopped. All of it existed for one reason. Far to the east, Patton's tanks were still sitting empty, still waiting, and every hour they waited, the Germans dug in a little deeper, and the war got a little longer. The whole roaring river was a race against that one clock, so let's meet him properly, the man at the wheel, because the newsreels that filmed the tanks rolling east never once turned the camera on him, and if they had, they'd have shown you the thing this story almost always leaves out. Around 3/4 of the drivers on the Red Ball Express, roughly 75%, were African American soldiers. And that was not an accident, and it was not because they volunteered for the worst job. It was policy. The United States Army in 1944 was segregated, top to bottom, by law and by custom, and the men who ran that army had decided, against a mountain of evidence and their own soldiers' wishes, that black men could not be trusted in combat. So black soldiers were funneled, by the tens of thousands, into what the army called service units, the quartermaster corps, port battalions, truck companies. They loaded the ships, they carried the ammunition, they dug, they built, and they drove. And they carried the segregation with them the whole way. One of those drivers, a man named Washington Rector, put it plainly, years later. "You accepted discrimination," he said. "We were warned not to fraternize with whites, for fear problems would arise." That was the deal these men were handed. Do the country's hardest, most vital hauling, and do it at arm's length from the men whose lives you were saving. Sit with the irony of that for a second, because it is the whole story. The fuel that kept the white combat spearheads rolling across France, the gasoline without which Patton's celebrated tanks were just cold steel by the roadside, was hauled to the front, overwhelmingly, by the very men the army had decided were not good enough to fight. Let me give you one of them, because he is real and his words survived. His name was James Ruckard, and decades after the war, he described what those nights were actually like. "We had to drive slowly at night," he said, "because we had to use cat's eyes, and you could hardly see. And then this, I've driven when I couldn't hardly see, just by instinct. You sort of feel the road. And then, quietly, the part that stays with you. There were dead bodies and dead horses on the highways after bombs dropped. I was scared, but I did my job, hoping for the best." That is the Redballexpress. Not the tonnage figures, not the map of two highways. A frightened young man, in the dark, half blind, feeling the road through the wheel, driving past the dead, doing his job, hoping for the best. 20-hour days, no real sleep. Trucks loaded past the point of safety, and two words holding it all together: keep rolling. And on the far side of the line, the Germans could not work it out. They had bombed the ports. They knew, from their own reconnaissance, that the Americans were hundreds of miles from their supplies, that by every rule of war, this advance should be sputtering and dying for lack of fuel. And yet the American tanks kept appearing, kept being gassed up, kept coming. They went looking for the secret, and they looked in the wrong place because there was no secret weapon to find. The secret was a road at night, and a scared man at a wheel, feeling his way past the dead, doing it again and again and again. The Redballexpress ran until the middle of November 1944. By then the great port of Antwerp was open, the railroads were being patched back together, and the emergency eased. The loop roads reopened to ordinary traffic. The Red Bull signs came down off the junctions, one by one, and the men who had driven it went back to being what the army had always treated them as: unseen. In the official reports, they were rarely even named. The operation was praised, the men were a statistic, and the races in that army were kept so far apart, the drivers so completely invisible to the men they were saving, that some of those white veterans lived out their entire long lives and died without ever knowing that most of the men who kept them fueled and moving and alive were black. They were carried through the war, mile after mile, by men they never saw and never once thought to look for. And then something happened that is almost too bitter to believe. Hollywood made a movie about them. In 1952, a film came out called, of course, The Redballexpress. And you might think, good, finally, the story gets told. Except the studio cast a white actor in the lead and pushed the real drivers, the black men who were 3/4 of the whole operation, into the background of their own story. The director, years later, was blunt about why. The army, he said, would not let them tell the truth about the black troops because the government, in his words, figured they were expendable. So the one time the country made a monument to these men, it painted them out of it. For decades, that was where it stood. And then slowly, historians and archivists and the drivers' own families began to do the thing this whole channel exists to do. They went back to the records. They found the oral histories. They found men like Washington Rector and James Ruckard still alive, still remembering, and they wrote it down before it was lost. Piece by piece, the real story of the Redballexpress was pulled back out of the dark it had been left in. So go back, one last time, to that young man at the wheel, at the end of his run, pulling into the supply dump as the sky goes grey. He climbs down stiff, half-blind with tiredness. The fuel he carried through the night is already being pumped into tanks that will roll east and be in the newsreels by morning. Nobody films him. Nobody thanks him. In a few hours, he'll turn the empty truck around and start back down the road marked with that red ball and do the whole thing again. He is not in the story you were taught. For a long time, he was not in the story at all. He should be. The war moved, mile after mile after mile, because he kept driving through the dark, and the least we owe him, all these years later, is to finally look. Before you go, I've got a question for you. Before today, had you ever even heard of the redballexpress? And did anyone in your family serve in a supply or transport unit, the men who kept everyone else moving? Tell me in the comments. Those are exactly the stories that get forgotten, and this channel exists to keep them. And if you've stayed this long, 3 small things help keep this channel going. If you haven't liked the video, it takes a second, and it goes a long way toward putting this story in front of the people who'd want it most. Subscribe so you don't miss the next file. I open one every week. And share this one with someone who'd enjoy it. Until next time, take care.